Hello, and thank you for joining us for another pre-concert talk with our Masterwork series, the Florida Orchestra. I'm Ed Parsons, General Manager, and it's a pleasure to have with us our guest conductor for the week, Jeannette Sorrell. Welcome, Jeannette.
Thank you, Ed. Great to be here.
So Jeannette is a specialist in Baroque and classical period music. She's the founder and music director of the acclaimed Grammy Award-winning group Apollo's Fire, based in Cleveland, Ohio. And it's so great to have you back. The musicians just adore working with you. The last time you were here, and they're really excited to have you back.
Well, thank you. It's such a fun group to work with.
And of course, when we have a Baroque and classical period specialist, we're going to play some Baroque and classical music for you. So, as a specialist in this kind of music, there are some things that you ask the musicians to do that are a little different than we do when we play romantic and sort of contemporary kind of music. Can you tell us what are some of those kind of stylistic kind of things?
Sure, quite a few things. A lot of it is about how we use the bow for the string players, and I'm generally asking them to use their bow more the way they would if they held a Baroque bow. So a Baroque bow is lighter and shorter, and it just has a different balance to it. So if you watch the string players closely in the concert, you'll see that they're using their bow faster and often using up a lot of it at the beginning of the note and getting to the tip quickly and doing a lot of kind of small bow things as well. So there's just like a very wide palette of different bow strokes that we're using, or what we call articulations.
And also a sort of different sound that they might produce by using less vibrato in the strings and a sort of purer sound, using the vibrato more as an ornament to that rather than a sort of autopilot.
Exactly. Yeah.
And for the first half of the program, you'll be leading from harpsichord. Can you talk a little bit about the history of that, of sort of conductors playing from the harpsichord, leading from that, and why you're doing that in the Baroque pieces and not in the second half when we do the more classical music?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we know from descriptions that Baroque orchestras were led most often by the composer who was the harpsichordist typically. So led from the harpsichord, but sometimes led from the violin, just dependent on whether the composer, Vivaldi was primarily a violinist, so he led his pieces from the violin. Bach led from the keyboard. But it's, either way, it's very much a collaborative process. I always love to work with the concertmaster and the principal cellist first, so that the three of us can get on the same page, and then they can sort of amplify what I'm doing out to the rest of the players.
Right, it becomes more like chamber music when you're a player too and sort of working together. Mm-hmm. So the four works that we're going to perform this weekend will be pretty unfamiliar to most audiences, but as you'll discover, they are real gems worth some more attention. And they all bring a bit of lightness and humor, which is something we can all use a bit of these days, right? And the first two pieces are by Georg Philipp Telemann. Telemann was the great master of the late Baroque and early classical period. He was widely admired in his time, especially by his very close friends Bach and Handel. Certainly good company to keep. His musical output was enormous, composing over 3,000 pieces of music in his lifetime. And while he was German and wrote much music in the German style, he was also sort of an international composer, embracing the styles of France and Italy, and in the case of our first work, Poland. And this work is called the Concerto Polonois. It uses Polish folk songs, and this title, Concerto, we shouldn't expect the soloist is going to walk out with you, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah, they used the term more loosely back then, but it basically means that it's an orchestral piece with some contrast in it. Concerto really came from the word contrasting. But as you were saying, Ed, the piece is quite folk-inspired. Telemann used to spend his summers in the countryside in Poland, so he got to hear Polish folk musicians. And so the first movement you get the sense of kind of like bagpipes and rustic instruments, and then the slow movement is a polonaise, and the finale is a kind of a polka, actually.
Telemann polka. How wonderful. And the next piece is also by Telemann. It's the Burlesque Suite. And people might think, well, the last time I heard, saw Jeannette Sorrell with the Florida Orchestra, she played the Burlesque Suite. It was called Don Quixote, but this is a different
suite.
Burlesque Suite.
Yeah. This one is inspired by the Italian Renaissance tradition of commedia dell'arte. You remember the characters like Harlequin, Columbine, Pierrot, Scaramouche. Those were the stock characters of the Italian street theater in the Renaissance. And they each have a kind of distinctive personality. So Telemann wrote one movement depicting each of those characters. And so it's a very playful and colorful suite.
Then we move into the classical period with a piece by André Grétry, his Beauty and the Beast suite. And of our three composers on this program, André Grétry was probably the least familiar to most of our audience. He was born in Liège, which is now Belgium, but lived and worked in France with a few diversions to Italy, but took French citizenship eventually and was, at the end of his life, awarded the Cross of the Legion of Honor by Napoleon himself, so definitely well regarded in France. He lived squarely in the classical period between 1741 and 1816, and the bulk of his compositional output was opera, and in particular, comedic opera. He wrote over 60 operas in his lifetime, 40 of which those are comedies. And the music we'll perform is a suite of pieces from his opera, The Beauty and the Beast, one of those comic operas. It's one of his more famous operas. In fact, it's still staged by companies today. And we can also assume that it was admired by Mozart himself, since a copy of the score was found in his apartment after his death. And this is a suite that you put together from the opera, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
yes.
So tell us about why it's special to you.
So it's interesting because today nobody's ever heard of this opera. The French title is Émile et Azor, which is Beauty and the Beast. But at the time, it was a sensation. It was one of the blockbuster hits of all time. And it was performed hundreds of times in the late 18th century and the early 19th century, translated into 15 languages. They performed it in St. Petersburg, everywhere across Europe, London. So the appeal, I got to sort of see what the appeal is when I was conducting the opera itself with St. Louis Opera, where we did it every night, so many nights, can't remember how many nights. But every night the audience would go crazy for certain pieces. And so I kind of took the pieces that had drawn the best audience reaction and I put them together in a suite. So the overture is very stormy because it represents a shipwreck. That's how the opera begins, shipwrecked on this mysterious island. And you'll hear in the overture like lightning and wind. And then the entr'acte is where we meet the three sisters who are very sweet and tender. Then we get the flight of the cloud. So the enchanted beast sends Beauty home to see her family for a little bit, sends her on a cloud. And then the last two pieces that I put into this suite are, there's a tambourin, which is like a very rustic French parade. And we end with the Egyptian dance, which is kind of like an 18th century Baroque composer's idea of Middle Eastern music.
Right, you probably never went there.
Probably not, yeah.
Yeah. Well, we finish our program with the biggest name of the classical period, of course, that's Mozart. But we stay in the realm of the relatively unfamiliar with his 33rd Symphony. It's the smallest instrumentation of all the late symphonies, with just pairs of oboes, bassoons, and horns along with the strings. Mozart was working through some very difficult times when he composed the 33rd Symphony in 1779. He had just returned from a very unsuccessful 16-month tour of Europe, he was trying to get a new permanent position, to get out of his position in Salzburg, which he was unsuccessful doing. And on that trip, his mother died unexpectedly. This was a real tragedy in his life, and affected him deeply. And it's even more amazing that this symphony is so filled with lightness and happiness. But of course, Mozart was no brooding romanticist. He probably never occurred to him to insert his own feelings into his piece of music that he was writing, probably because it was commissioned for some special occasion, though we don't know for sure. We don't have any record of what that might have been. It is, for some reason, pretty rarely performed, especially compared to its more famous late-period compatriots, like the Paris, Hofner, Prague 39th, 40th, and Jupiter. But this is a symphony that you have taken under your wing and performed a number of times. So what is it special for you? There's a practicality there, because you lead a small sort of chamber orchestra, and the smallness of it is sort of part of it.
It doesn't have too many wind players in it, which made it possible for this situation here. We're being careful not to have too many winds during the pandemic. So that's one thing. But it's a very playful symphony, and in particular, the finale is really like a romp. And it's a really fun workout for the players. It's very fast. So it keeps the orchestra in shape because it has to be so precise and super fast. The other thing that's cool about the symphony is that in the development section of the first movement, you will hear a four-note theme that I believe you will recognize, which is the theme that Mozart later used in the finale of the Jupiter Symphony.
Right. Which was a theme that he used throughout his life, even from early pieces. That's sort of one of his favorite themes that comes back. And you mentioned the fourth movement. It's interesting to note that the original version of the symphony didn't have a fourth movement. He added it later for the audiences in Vienna, because he felt like it needed something a little bit more when he premiered it in Vienna, and so he added it, and then he loved it so much that he had it published in Vienna, and it became a permanent part.
Fascinating. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So it just ended with the minuet in Salzburg.
Or it was in different order or something. But they didn't. It originally was a three-movement symphony, and he added a fourth movement. Later on.
Cool.
Yeah, well, it's a wonderful, wonderful program of music that I'm sure people will go home and get recordings of because they haven't heard it before. And you bring such life to this music in a very special way. And we're so glad that you can join us, and you made the trip all the way down from Cleveland during these times.
Well, glad to be here, and I just think it's fantastic that this orchestra has found a way to do concerts during the pandemic and do it safely. And I know it's a real labor of love for the management and the musicians who have to get tested all the time. But it's fairly unusual. So many orchestras are just not doing anything this year. So
yeah, well, we're happy to do it, and we hope that you can join us for this wonderful concert this weekend.